Hey, it's communism. Communism in America. Don't adjust your whatever device you're listening to this on. It's me, live and on stereo. So get a snack, settle in, because I'm about to tell you the story of my life. More specifically, how my life is ending. And if you're listening to this video, you're one of the reasons why. The rules here are simple. Number 1, you listen. Number 2, you pass it on. Now, before I jump into my first reason, I'd like to clarify a couple things for you. First of all, what am I? According to dictionary.com, communism is the advocacy for a classless society in which private ownership has been abolished and the means of production and subsistence belong to the community. What's the difference between me and socialism? For the most part, socialism is just a less intense version of communism. Both share the core value of equality. Because of this, I'm going to consider any step towards socialism to be a step towards communism. Similarly, commune living is basically communism on a smaller scale, and so any allowance of that lifestyle should also be considered a step towards communism. So now, what is capitalism and its values? Capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. Its key value is individualism, and is the economic system under which we currently live. Throughout history and still today, communism, have been a great topic of controversy in America. Though some of my ideas have been adopted and incorporated in society, others have been feverishly rejected and shut down by all means possible. In general, the trend of my popularity and opposition tend to be relatively consistent. A wave of radical leftism followed by a stronger wave of resistance, eventually followed again by a stronger wave of leftism, and so on and so forth. So, you may be asking yourself, when did this all start? I guess it really all started back in 1492. Before then, things were much simpler. The Native Americans were the only ones living in America, and their way of life generally combined elements of both capitalism and communism. For example, in some Native American societies, individuals were allowed to keep some of their crops while another portion had to be shared communally. Now, I know you settlers didn't come here with your guns, germs, and steel to squash communism in early America, but to some extent that was the effect you had. From the beginning, you considered the native people to be your inferiors. First, you increased native private ownership of material goods through your gun and fur trade. Then you ruthlessly murdered and disrupted these people's way of life. As time goes on, we can see that major increases in American capitalism directly correlate to a greater oppression of the Native American peoples, to the point at which you basically exterminated an entire race for land and profit. It started small, settlers getting into smaller skirmishes, but then escalated into bloody wars and battles, from King Philip's War in 1675 all the way to the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. Additionally, there's the deadly Trail of Tears, in which the entire Cherokee Nation was forced to move west thanks to the gold rush and Manifest Destiny. The exploitation of an entire race of peoples for the sole purpose of economic gain is a direct contradiction of my core value of equality for all people. As people were settling in America from 1607 to 1754, there was a continuation of Native American conflicts, and individualistic values began to become popular with settlers. Tensions began to rise between American settlers and Great Britain as Americans became infuriated that they were being used for economic reasons by Great Britain. This escalated into the Revolutionary War. After emerging victorious, these new Americans debated on how their new government should function. Two men, Hamilton and Jefferson, were particularly influential. Jefferson's agricultural-based economy and egalitarian views made his proposed government pretty well aligned with communist values. Hamilton's proposed government, on the other hand, reflected capitalistic ideas such as elitism and industrialization. Elements of both men's ideas were incorporated into the Articles of Confederation, which in turn helped shape the Constitution. Despite T.J.'s famous quote, "All men are created equal," nothing in the Constitution itself says anything about equality. That is until the incorporation of the 14th Amendment in 1868. In fact, in framing the Constitution, Madison argued that the primary goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, and thus America became a republic and not a true democracy, and inequality was inherent within the system itself. If we jump to the War of 1812, we see the second war America fought to protect the dignity of its economy. That's right, America once again is trading human lives for economic gain. The success of the War of 1812 led to an upsurge of nationalism. Though communism rejects religion, the Second Great Awakening increased communist values in America by putting a greater emphasis on the common man and societal reform. One of the effects of the Second Great Awakening was the formation of utopian-based societies. For example, there was the Oneida Community in 1848, founded on the ideas of free love and equality. The Oneidas lived communally, but were ultimately unsuccessful due largely to the society's rejection of their questionable marriage practices. Today, the Oneidas are capitalistic and sell flatware and cutlery. We can also see the beginnings of the abolitionist movement in the North, and thus a rise in egalitarian thought. On the other hand, the invention of the cotton gin and the South created a greater separation of class. A growing divide occurred between the North and the South. It is interesting to note that while the North had a more industrial economy, they held stronger egalitarian beliefs due to their opposition to slavery. An entire war was fought because half of America still believed that enslaving an entire race of people was justified for economic reasons. The Civil War eventually broke out to once and for all resolve the issue of slavery, and the North emerged victorious. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the South, which you would think would cause an upsurge in egalitarianism, right? Not quite. During Reconstruction, there was increased discrimination, violence, and oppression towards African Americans, particularly in the South. Black codes were passed to try and limit the new freedoms and rights of free blacks. Despite the success of the abolitionist movement, there was still no women's suffrage. On the other hand, some large strides were made towards equality during this time. For example, former slaves now had the freedom of movement, freedom to learn, freedom to worship, and freedom to own land, which was all revolutionary for the time period. Reconstruction drew to a close and brought about the Gilded Age. Manifest Destiny increased the capitalistic emphasis on the individual, imperialism, and personal property. Capitalism became particularly prominent with the advancement of industrialization. Corruption and monopolies ruled the government. Government and private industry worked hand in hand. There were a great number of reformers who, during this period and into the Progressive Era, attempted to reform the horrible effects of industrialization. Some of the reformers, including Eugene Debs and Mother Jones, were socialists. There was a formation of unions to advocate for workers' rights. A couple of these unions, like the IWW, were socialist in nature. Despite these socialist developments, capitalism was still very much at play, and the working class was very oppressed. Companies would fire striking workers, and scabs would take their old jobs. Businesses would scare their workers out of voting for populist party members, thus rendering their right to vote useless. The 14th Amendment was extended to include corporations as people. The ideas of the American dream and individualism were spread through Horatio Alger's dime novels. The first Red Scare was a wave of paranoia that washed over America following news of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. The rise of unions and strikes posed as a major threat to big businesses. In response, strikers, regardless of the union they belonged to, were labeled agents of Lenin. General Mitchell Palmer conducted a series of Palmer raids in which suspected subversives were illegally searched, or thrown in jail or deported for any un-American activity. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 limited the right of freedom of speech, in that it prohibited, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious writings against the government of the United States, or either House of the Congress of the United States, or the President of the United States with intent to defame. Eugene Debs, for example, was put into prison due to his opposition to the United States entering into World War I. Limiting the freedom of speech so that one may not criticize the government? Why, that sounds familiar. Alright, this was just like the Zenger libel case in the colonies in 1735. Historically, the censorship of government criticisms is a sign of weak, paranoid, authoritarian states, like that of Nazi Germany or North Korea.
President Truman, addressing the Federal Bar Association, vigorously describes how his administration is fighting communism abroad and at home. And then he says,
"Now I'm going to tell you how we're not going to fight communism. We're not going to transform our fine FBI into a Gestapo secret police.
Back in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, the United States government had programs, some involving simple surveillance, some involving ways of getting information, some involving plots, basically to frame people for crimes, and some involving outright murder.
It was secret at the time because it was by and large illegal.
Really what COINTELPRO is a militarization of criminal justice.
It was a code word that was used by the FBI's actual war against the entire left movement.
To eliminate, intimidate, incarcerate, and terrorize a people.
It was a covert war strategy, and it was done because the government thought there was a war going on.
Everybody's locked up. That you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution.
We're not going to try to control what our people read and say and think. In short, we're not going to end democracy.
During World War II, there was an abundance of propaganda encouraging U.S. soldiers to join forces with the Soviets to take down the Nazis together. This propaganda quickly shifted against the USSR as Soviets began to gain power and influence post-war. For example, the House of Un-American Activities Committee, a branch of the U.S. government dedicated to the investigation of subversive activities, distributed a pamphlet in 1949 labeled 100 Things You Should Know About Communism. This pamphlet was a highly inaccurate, fear-mongering piece of propaganda distributed to the average American citizen in order to deter them from developing communist sympathies and to report any suspicious communist activities around them. Some notable quotes from the pamphlet include, "Under communism, could I have friends of my own like I do now? No, except those approved by the communists in charge of your life from cradle to grave." And, "What is the difference between a communist and a fascist? None worth noting."
We're going to keep the Bill of Rights on the books. If we all work together to maintain and strengthen our democratic ideals, communism will never be a serious threat to our American way of life.
The truth of the matter is that the government did in fact see communism as a major threat. This is abundantly evident by the actions of the Second Red Scare. During this period, thousands of government workers were accused of being communists. The man in charge of these accusations even had a term named after him: McCarthyism. McCarthyism is the practice of making accusations of subversion or treason without proper regard for the evidence. This even extended beyond government and into Hollywood. Actors and artists accused of communist sympathies were denied employment. It was essentially a censorship of the arts. The only movies that were produced were anti-communist and pro-American propaganda. The Hollywood 10 was a group of 10 Hollywood actors who stood before the House of Un-American Activities for supposedly injecting communist propaganda into their films. They argued that they were protected under the First Amendment, but Congress held them in contempt for refusing to answer questions despite the fact that being communist wasn't an actual crime. The execution of the Rosenbergs also shows the level of paranoia held within the government at the time. Though it was proven that Julius Rosenberg was a Soviet spy, there is not sufficient evidence to prove that his wife Ethel was a spy as well, yet they were both put to death by electric chair. The events of the Second Red Scare are very comparable to the Salem witch trials in 1692. In both, paranoia caused people to point fingers at one another without evidence to support their suspicions. Both movements died when the accusations became ridiculously outlandish. The great irony of the Second Red Scare was that in feeling threatened by an authoritarian communist government, the United States government became more authoritarian by fear-mongering, using political repression, and preventing true democracy from taking place. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Timothy 6:10. During the New Deal, there was a Christian revival invoked by conservatives to promote free enterprise and limit the regulations placed on businesses. Religion and capitalism became most intertwined under the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s, and the government hopped on the capitalism and Christianity bandwagon. Christianity and capitalism, both being ideologies threatened by communism, teamed up together to fight it. Consequently, this is the point at which Americans started to label communism as evil, despite that communism's core value of equality lined up pretty well with the teachings of the Christian Church. It is during the Eisenhower administration that the phrase, "In God we trust," was added to paper currency and stamps. This idea of America being a Christian nation is extended strongly into the Reagan administration and can be seen in the speech The Evil Empire. Reagan, being the conservative Presbyterian president at a time in which the Soviet Union was still seen as a threat to America, never hesitated to incorporate his religious views into his speeches despite the concept of separation of church and state. To quote some of his speech, "American experiment in democracy rests on this insight. Its discovery was the great triumph of our founding fathers, voiced by William Penn when he said, 'If we will not be governed by God, we must be governed by tyrants.' Explaining the inalienable rights of men, Jefferson said, 'The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time.' And it was George Washington who said, 'Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports.'" In this portion of the speech, it is clear that Reagan is emphasizing to the American people how interconnected Christianity and government are. Why is he doing this? Well, later in his speech he says, quote, a number of years ago, I heard a young father, a very prominent young man in the entertainment world, addressing a tremendous gathering in California. It was during my time of the Cold War, and communism and our way of life were very much on people's minds. And he was speaking to that subject. And suddenly I heard him saying, 'I love my little girls more than anything.' And I said to myself, 'Oh no, don't say that.' But I had underestimated him." He went on, "I would rather see my little girls die now, still believing in God, than have them grow up under communism and one day no longer believing in God." There were thousands of young people in that audience. They came to their feet with shouts of joy. They instantly recognized the profound truth in what he had said with the physical regard to the soul and what was truly important. Now these were powerful words. The president is claiming that he and thousands of young people would rather kill their own children than allow them to live without religion under a communist system. Trying to fight communism in America, the government suppressed many important social and cultural movements. For example, the hippies were a left-leaning anti-government group who lived in communes. They supported civil rights, women's rights, free love, drug usage, and most notably they opposed the Vietnam War. By 1967, the hippie movement began to dwindle. Malnutrition, drug addiction, and disease plagued the movement. In 1969, things became violent. A group of hippies at Berkeley, a college Reagan termed as a haven for communist sympathizers, protesters, and sex deviants, turned an empty lot into a park. In retaliation, the government tore down the hippies' Peace Park by order of Reagan, and consequently a series of deadly riots ensued, leaving 128 students injured. Another prominent movement of the 1960s was the Civil Rights Movement. The Communist Party was in full support of the Civil Rights Movement, which unfortunately increased government opposition to it. The civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Angela Davis were kept close tabs on by the government. As part of COINTELPRO, FBI agents even urged King to commit suicide in a letter saying, "There's only one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation." A small victory for the civil rights movement was the innocent verdict in the trial of communist Black Panther Angela Davis. The Lavender Scare during the late 50s and early 60s was a witch hunt by the government against homosexuals because the government believed homosexuals were most likely to join the communist movement because they could be easily blackmailed. American communist movements also sided with feminist movements, and similarly the government retaliated by labeling the feminist movement an incubator of sexual depravity and communism. In trying to fight communism, the U.S. grossly pushed back progress in important social issues. From the 70s until today, especially with the decline of the Soviet Union in 1991, the American Communist Party lost more and more power, membership, and influence. Even today, we can see evidence of the Red Scare inherent within American culture, as there is still strong resentment and misunderstanding towards the ideas of communism. This was not, however, the end. Many leftists chose instead to opt for socialist movements, as they were less intense and the connotation wasn't as bad. In 2016, Bernie Sanders became the first Democratic socialist to run for president outside of prison. There's a handful of socialist policies within our government today, such as free public education up to high school, social security, and infrastructure. It is unlikely that leftist movements will ever disappear completely from America, because as long as there's a minority group, which there will always be under capitalism, there will be leftism.